Hello, I just want to talk to you guys a little bit about some Roman history, and we're going to start way back very early on. And for today, I just want to kind of briefly do a recap of one of the greatest books ever written, namely Virgil's Aeneid. And you guys read that in 10th grade. Um, so this is one of the kind of foundational myths for the Roman people, and it arises out of the journeys and the warfare that Aeneas fights and wanders. The book opens with the lines, "I sing of arms and a man," and Virgil right away harkens back to the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey with Homer. And book book one of the Aeneid, we find Aeneas. He is kind of in the middle of the ocean. He's being harassed by Juno and her anger at the Trojans, and he eventually winds up on the shores of North Africa, and he visits the queen there, named Dido, and the two become lovers eventually. Um, and book two is Aeneas's recounting of the fall of Troy. So we get a really powerful, moving picture of how Troy fell from someone who was, from someone who was there and who saw things happen, um, and Aeneas, what he does is in book end of book two, going into book three, Aeneas leads basically the refugees from the fall of Troy. He leads them away so that they can go found a new settlement, and they journey the Mediterranean. They go to several different locations. It's very kind of reminiscent of the Odyssey, and they actually kind of go to, or pass by at least, some of the places mentioned in the Odyssey. And then book four, they kind of pick back up with the story of Aeneas and Dido. Now, Dido, as I think I said, was the queen of Carthage. Now, as we will look at a little bit later, Carthage is going to be very important in Roman history, because Rome is going to be fighting a series of wars with Carthage that are really of monumental proportions. But that is, historically quite a ways down the road. All right. So the time frame from the fall of Troy till the Trojans reach Carthage is several years. It's not sure exactly how many, but it is several. And then book five of the Aeneid, the Trojans are in Sicily. They have left Carthage, and there's some funeral games for Aeneas's father, and then you have some discontentment among the Trojan people, and certain groups of the Trojans stay on Sicily. So it's a smaller group then that continues on the journey to Italy. All right. Book six, they reach Italy, and Aeneas has this journey that he takes to the underworld. And this is a very important aspect of epic poems. The heroes often have some sort of monumental task, a lot of times part of it being going to the underworld. So Aeneas goes to the underworld, and he learns there about some of the future history and greatness of the Roman people. And it kind of gives him hope and courage, and let him know what he's doing is worthwhile. Book 7, the Trojans are now in, they're in Italy, and this is kind of the second half of the book. And the second half of the book is largely modeled off the Iliad. There's going to be a lot of fighting, a lot of warfare going on. And Juno, who I mentioned earlier, she really stirs things up through some of her cronies, her agents, and she kind of gets the locals really fired up against the Trojans as they are trying to establish themselves. Book 8, Aeneas gets some allies, some local allies, and we get some important places and rituals and everything that will show up later in Roman culture and everything. Also, Book 8, Aeneas gets some really awesome weapons from his mommy, his mom's Venus. And one of the very cool things that he gets is a shield with some of the great deeds and acts of Roman history engraven on it. And it's a really powerful picture of him kind of taking the Roman race kind of upon himself. All right. Book 9, Aeneas is away from the camp because he's trying to get some allies, and the camp gets besieged by the kind of one of the ringleaders of the locals that are against the Trojans, a guy named Turnus. And this is where we get the story about Nisus and Euryalus sneaking out to try to bring word to Aeneas, and then getting betrayed by you may remember, the shiny helmet that gives them away. And we had this translation about this end of Latin 1, semester 1. All right. All right, and then Book 10, Aeneas returns with some allies. They do a lot of fighting and everything. And then Book 11, we got more fighting. And Book 12, we got more fighting. And eventually Aeneas emerges as the conqueror. He takes out his kind of arch nemesis there in Italy, a guy named Turnus. So this is like a really, really quick, with very minimal detail there, recap of the Aeneid. But just a couple things to kind of keep in mind when thinking about some of this really early Roman. This is almost more mythology, really more mythology than history per se. But the Romans like to be able to trace their ancestry back to heroes and to gods. And Aeneas is kind of the great whatever grandfather of Romulus. So the fall of Troy is roughly set in the 12th century BC, roughly. And then the rise of Rome, the founding of Rome, is 753. So it's about 400-ish years before the founding of Rome. So this is and a couple interesting things too. You see with the Romans here that they are tracing their history back to a hero, back to the gods, because Aeneas was the son of Venus. But you'll notice their history goes back to the Trojans. And I think this is really interesting. I was reading something about this a while back too, but the Trojans were a people that were conquered and defeated. But you kind of have this theme of this kind of up from the ashes. This new hope is arising, and Aeneas has this great destiny before him, even though the first city that he was part of, Troy, fell. So there's this kind of sense that that there is another hope. There's a better hope that the Romans have, that and also kind of an honor that is given to people that fight valiantly, and then they lose. So it's kind of interesting that the Romans would kind of have the Trojans be their ancestors. It's not what you might normally expect, is tracing back to people that are always victorious. All right, it's just something to think about. That sometimes, even when we are conquered, when we are beaten, there is still hope. And the Romans, obviously, especially early on, were very much not Christian, but you can see certain elements of truth in what they believe. The Bible tells us that Jesus will not extinguish a smoldering wick. He will not break a bruised reed. And although this was not originally meant as anything Christian, Virgil was not a Christian by any means. You can see elements of truth kind of in the Trojan and the Roman story, that the people that are beaten still have hope, and there is going to be a restoration. All right. So that's kind of a very, like I said, very quick recap of some very early Roman myths about their founding. So Aeneas leads refugees from Troy and reaches Italy and establishes them there. Later, we will pick up with kind of a little bit of the mythology from Aeneas to the founding of Troy, and then we'll talk about some of the history of Rome as well. Again, this is all going to be very, very general, very brief. Feel free to ask me any questions if you got any. I am not a history expert by any means, but I will, if you got questions, I will try to answer them. All right. So I love you guys, and I'll talk to you later.